There was a point in time where basically every movie needed three things: a theatrical release, a DVD, and for some reason, a video game. And I don't just mean the massive franchises. Obviously, Spider-Man had games, Harry Potter had games, Star Wars had games. Those make sense. I'm talking about everything. Shrek had games, Over the Hedge had games, Madagascar had games, Cars, Ratatouille, Chicken Little, Kung Fu Panda, The Bee Movie, The Polar Express, even Charlie and the Chocolate Factory had a game. If a movie had a vaguely marketable character on the poster, somebody somewhere was being given 18 months to turn it into a PlayStation 2 game. And the weirdest thing is, we all just accepted this. And of course, there's a B movie game, and it was actually pretty good. I mean, why wouldn't it be? But then at some point, they disappeared. Think about the biggest movies you've watched over the last decade. Where was the Dune game? The Oppenheimer game? Okay, maybe not those two. But where was the traditional Frozen game? The Inside Out game? The Puss in Boots The Last Wish game? The Batman game? We still get games based on movies and television franchises, obviously, but something fundamentally changed, because the old school movie tie-in game wasn't simply a licensed game. It was essentially the playable version of whatever was currently playing at the movie theater. The movie came out, the game came out. You watch Spider-Man fight Doc Ock on Saturday, and on Sunday you're trying to do the same thing on your PlayStation 2. Sometimes these games were terrible. Actually, a lot of them were terrible. But occasionally, something bizarre happened. A rushed marketing product made primarily to capitalize on a movie would somehow become really, really good. And in some cases, these disposable little license games would introduce mechanics that eventually influenced gaming for years afterwards. So what happened? Why did publishers make so many movie games? Why were they almost always rushed? Why did some of them become classics? And why did an entire category of video game basically disappear? Because the answer isn't that people suddenly stopped liking movie games. The answer is that video games became too big to make them. Movie tie-in games are almost as old as the video game industry itself, and one of the earliest famous examples also happens to be one of the most infamous games ever made, E.T. the Extraterrestrial. The story has almost become gaming mythology at this point. Spielberg released E.T. in 1982. The movie becomes an enormous cultural phenomenon. Atari gets the license, and suddenly the company wants an E.T. game on store shelves in time for Christmas. There was just one small problem. Christmas was basically around the corner. Designer Howard Scott Warshaw was reportedly given only a matter of weeks to create the game. Not years, not 18 months. Weeks. And when you actually think about it, the surprising thing isn't that E.T. was bad. The surprising thing is that a functioning game came out at all. But that's important because it establishes a problem that would follow movie games for decades. The movie has a release date. The game, therefore, has a release date as well. And that date doesn't care whether the game is finished or not. A normal game can theoretically be delayed. A movie tie-in game releasing 6 months after the movie? That's a problem.
I'm in danger!
Because the entire point is to capitalize on the marketing machine surrounding the film. The trailers are running, the toys are in stores, McDonald's has the cups. The movie is everywhere, and your game needs to be everywhere too. That made movie licenses incredibly attractive. A publisher didn't have to convince people that the characters mattered. Hollywood had already spent millions of dollars doing that for them. If you saw Batman on the box, you knew Batman. If you saw Jurassic Park, you knew Jurassic Park. If you saw Harry Potter, your parents knew exactly what you were asking for. And that last part matters because movie games weren't necessarily selling to hardcore gamers. A huge part was marketed to kids. You watch Lion King, you love the Lion King, then you're walking through a store with your parents and wait, there's a Lion King game? That's an incredibly powerful sales pitch when you're 8 years old. You don't know who developed it, you don't care what engine it's running, you haven't watched Digital Foundry's analysis, you saw Simba, you want Simba. And publishers knew that. By the late 80s and 90s, licensed games were everywhere. Disney especially became synonymous with them. Aladdin, The Lion King, Jungle Book, Toy Story. And this era produced something interesting, because some licensed games were actually technically impressive. Aladdin is probably one of the best examples. Disney animators were involved in creating the character animations, and the result was a game that generally looked like someone had taken the movie and squeezed it into a Genesis cartridge. That was incredibly appealing in the 90s because remember what games looked like at the time. The gap between film and video game graphics was enormous. Today, if you want to experience Hogwarts, you can load up Hogwarts Legacy and walk around an enormous detailed recreation of the castle. Back then, seeing recognizable characters moving around the television was enough. It felt like you were controlling the movie, even if the game itself was only vaguely related to what had happened on screen. And developers became very good at translating movies into gaming language of the time. Movie character needs to get from point A to point B, platformer. Movie has fighting, beat 'em up. Movie has vehicles, throw in a racing level. Does the movie actually have enough action to support an entire game? Doesn't matter, we'll figure it out. And that philosophy would become even more obvious once games entered 3D. For me, the PlayStation 2, GameCube, and original Xbox generation is where movie tie-in games became absolutely ridiculous. And I mean ridiculous in the best way possible, because there were so many of them. Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, Lord of the Rings and the Two Towers, The Return of the King, Spider-Man, Spider-Man 2, The Incredibles, Cars, Madagascar, Shrek 2, King Kong, Finding Nemo, Ratatouille, Over the Hedge, Transformers, The Chronicles of Narnia, Pirates of the Caribbean. If your parents took you to any store in the 2000s, half the shelf looked like a DVD collection. And there was a reason this particular era was perfect for these games. Game development was becoming sophisticated enough to create recognizable 3D versions of movie worlds, but it wasn't yet so expensive and time-consuming that every major release needed 5 years and hundreds of developers. That created this strange economic sweet spot. A publisher could acquire a popular license, give the game to a competent studio, reuse an existing engine, develop something relatively quickly, release it alongside the movie, and potentially sell millions of copies based largely on the strength of the IP. And these games didn't need to be masterpieces. That's the part we forget sometimes when we look back at them nostalgically. Nobody was expecting Finding Nemo on PlayStation 2 to redefine interactive storytelling. It had one job. You like the movie, here are the characters, here's the music, here's the world, and now you can play it. That was enough, especially for kids. It was awesome because watching a movie is passive. The game let you stay inside that world after the credits rolled, and sometimes the game could even make the world feel bigger. This is where movie tie-ins become genuinely interesting to me, because the best ones didn't simply recreate the movie, they used the movie as a starting point. Harry Potter is a great example. The films obviously couldn't show you every classroom, every corridor, every weird little corner of Hogwarts, but a game could let you explore it. You weren't just watching Harry attend Hogwarts. You could wander around Hogwarts yourself. You could find secrets, go to classes, cast spells, fly around. The experience was fundamentally different from the film, and I think this is why people still have such an intense nostalgia for these games. You're not necessarily nostalgic for the gameplay mechanics, you're nostalgic for the feeling of being allowed inside the movie. The same thing happened with the Lord of the Rings games. These movies made Middle-earth feel enormous. Then the Two Towers and Return of the King basically said, cool, now here's a sword, go fight everyone. They weren't enormously complicated games, but they understood the fantasy. You watched Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli fight hundreds of Uruk-hai. Now you could do it. And then you had something like Peter Jackson's King Kong, which is probably one of the strangest movie games ever made, because Ubisoft looked at King Kong and apparently decided, what if we actually try it? The game removes most traditional HUD elements, weapons have limited ammunition, Jack has to physically call out how many rounds he has remaining, dinosaurs feel genuinely dangerous, the environments feel hostile, and then occasionally you play as Kong and just absolutely destroy everything. It's cinematic without constantly reminding you that you're playing a licensed product. Even today, people talk about King Kong because it actually tried to translate the feeling of the movie rather than simply recreate its plot. But there is one movie tie-in that towers almost everything else. And weirdly, it changed gaming. Spider-Man 2 should not have been as important as it was. On paper, this is exactly the kind of game we're talking about. Movie releases, Activision has the license, game releases alongside it, done. Except, Treyarch made one incredibly important decision. They made Manhattan open world, and more importantly, they made Spider-Man's webs attached to buildings. I know that sounds obvious now, but that changed everything. You weren't just pressing a button and watching Spider-Man float through New York. You had momentum, physics, you had to actually swing, you could climb buildings, jump off them, dive towards the street, fire a web, and launch yourself back into the air. And suddenly moving through the city was the game. You could ignore missions entirely and spend hours just swinging through Manhattan. I know I did. Probably more than I actually played the story. The game established a fantasy that Spider-Man games are still chasing. When Insomniac made Marvel's Spider-Man more than a decade later, web swinging wasn't optional. Players expected it. The movie tie-in had established the standard, and this wasn't the only time licensed games did something special. GoldenEye 007 on the Nintendo 64 is technically a Bond movie adaptation. It released well after the movie, which already gave the developers something most tie-ins didn't have: time. and that game became one of the defining console shooters of its generation. Think about how absurd that is. One of the most important first-person shooters ever made is a movie tie-in game. That's the strange legacy of this genre. Most of these games were forgotten almost immediately, but occasionally the limitations created something brilliant. But we also need to be careful not to let nostalgia rewrite history, because for every Spider-Man 2, there were a lot of games that were clearly made because somebody had signed a licensing agreement. Movie games had a reputation for being bad, and that reputation wasn't completely unfair. The problem wasn't built into the business model. Imagine you're a developer. A publisher comes to you and says, here's a movie, here's a script that might not even be finished, the filmmakers might change things, the actors may or may not be available to record dialogue, you have to coordinate with a Hollywood studio, certain characters can't be used, certain story details can't be revealed before release, the movie itself is still being made, and by the way, this game has to ship on May 4th. Good luck.
I'm gonna make him an offer he can't refuse.
This is an insane way to make a video game. Sometimes developers were working from concept art because finished movie assets didn't exist yet. Sometimes entire scenes would change during production. Sometimes developers would need to reinvent huge portions of the game because a 2-hour movie simply doesn't contain enough material for a 10-hour game. And that created one of my favorite things about old movie games, the filler. So much filler. Remember a 30-second scene from the movie? Congratulations. Now, that's a 40-minute level. Character briefly drives somewhere? Racing mission. Someone mentions something off screen? Not anymore. That's a new level now. Congratulations. Random enemy appears for 3 seconds? Boss fight. The developers had to stretch these movies like pizza dough, and sometimes you ended up with a game that felt like a bizarre alternate cut of the movie. But the bigger issue was quality, because the release date was sacred. If a normal game needed another 6 months, the publisher could delay it. Not ideal, but possible. But if your Transformers game needs another 6 months and the movie came out yesterday, you're screwed. 6 months later, everyone has already moved on. The marketing campaign is finished, the toys are discounted, the DVD might already be out. The entire commercial reason for the game existing disappears. So games shipped unfinished. They ship buggy, repetitive, and consumers notice. Movie game became almost an insult. You would see a movie license on the box and immediately lower your expectations, and eventually publishers started lowering theirs too. Then the HD problem came in. When the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 arrived, something changed. Movie games still existed. We got Iron Man, Thor, Captain America's, Transformers, Green Lantern, Harry Potter, Cars, Kung Fu Panda, plenty of them. But games were getting more expensive. Higher resolution assets, more complicated animation, more detailed environments, more sophisticated AI, more voice acting, more cinematic presentation, online functionality, bigger teams. The baseline expectation for what a $60 console game should look like was rising, but the fundamental movie tie-in model hadn't changed. Develop it quickly, hit the release date, capitalize on the film. Those two trends were moving directly against each other. Games required more time. Movie tie-ins had almost no time. And the cracks became increasingly obvious. You could no longer make something that looked vaguely acceptable, put Wolverine on the cover and assume everyone would be happy. Players were comparing these games to Uncharted, Gears of War, Batman Arkham Asylum, Assassin's Creed. The quality had just exploded. And here's the really ironic part. One of the games that helped kill the traditional movie tie-in was probably Batman Arkham Asylum. Not literally, but philosophically. Because Arkham Asylum showed publishers that there were better ways to use the license. Now, Batman Arkham Asylum wasn't The Dark Knight, but it didn't need to be. It took Batman as an IP and built a game specifically around what Batman could do. Combat, stealth, detective work, exploration, gadgets. It created its own Batman universe. And because Rocksteady wasn't trying to recreate a specific 2-hour movie, the developers had freedom. They could create the version of Batman that worked best as a video game. And the result was better. Much better. The same philosophy eventually gave us Insomniac's Spider-Man. Why adapt Spider-Man Homecoming? Why force the developers to match Tom Holland's movie? Why build levels around scenes that were designed for film rather than gameplay? Just make a Spider-Man game. Create a new Peter Parker, a new story, take inspiration from decades of comics and movies. Use whichever villains make sense, and most importantly, release it when it's finished. Suddenly, the movie tie-in started looking like an unnecessarily restrictive way to use an incredibly valuable IP. Why make a disposable game promoting one movie when you could create an entirely new gaming franchise? And once publishers realized that, the traditional tie-ins days were numbered. This, more than anything, is why movie tie-in games disappeared. Modern AAA games take forever to make. 5 years is normal, sometimes longer. and that makes synchronizing a major game with a movie incredibly difficult. Think about the logistics. A Hollywood studio decides to make a movie. Scripts change, directors change, release dates move, production gets delayed. Then your game developer needs access to the film's assets, characters, environments, and story. But the developer also needs enough time to build an entire AAA game. That means development would potentially need to begin before the movie itself is properly locked in. And now both projects are dependent on each other. If the movie gets delayed, problem. If the game gets delayed, problem. If the movie changes its villain, huge problem. It's just unnecessary risk. And modern games are too expensive to treat as merchandise. And that's what movie tie-in games effectively were. Interactive merchandise. A DVD might cost $20, an action figure might cost $15. A PS2 game could be produced relatively cheaply and sold for full price. But a modern AAA game can cost tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars. You're not spending that money just to help promote a movie for 6 weeks. The game needs to succeed on its own, which means it needs to have its own identity, its own marketing campaign, its own development schedule, its own roadmap, maybe even DLC, maybe years of post-launch content. At that point, you're not making a movie tie-in game anymore. You're making a franchise. There's another part of this which I think gets overlooked. The middle of the games industry essentially disappeared. Not completely, but AAA development became increasingly polarized. You have enormous blockbuster games on one side and indie games on the other. The weird middle-budget AA license game became harder to justify. Because what exactly is the market for a $70 Despicable Me 4 console game? Kids still love Despicable Me, but parents are buying a full-price PlayStation 5 game because their child saw Minions? Maybe. But there's a much cheaper device already sitting in their pocket, a phone. And this completely changed licensed gaming. Because movie tie-ins didn't entirely disappear, a lot of them just moved. So if you're a movie studio and your goal is to create an interactive marketing product for kids, why make a console game? Seriously. Why spend millions developing a PlayStation and Xbox release? Why manufacture physical copies? Why fight for shelf space? Why convince parents to spend $60 when you can put something on iOS or Android? Suddenly, the economics make way more sense. Kids already have access to phones and tablets, development can be cheaper, distribution is digital, the audience is enormous, and the game can potentially be free. The last point is critical. The old movie tie-in game needed someone to buy it. The modern licensed mobile game can just monetize attention. Ads, microtransactions, cosmetics, currency, energy systems, whatever. And this coincided with the broader explosion of free-to-play games. So the low-end movie game didn't disappear because nobody wanted interactive versions of movie games. It disappeared because the phone was better at fulfilling its commercial purpose. The console movie game was just stuck in the middle. Too expensive to be disposable marketing, too rushed to compete with prestige AAA games. Mobile swallowed the cheap end. AAA gaming swallowed the premium end. And the traditional tie-in game had nowhere left to go. There is one company that basically figured out how to survive this transition, LEGO. Because LEGO games are technically licensed games, but they're not really movie tie-ins in the traditional sense. LEGO Star Wars, LEGO Harry Potter, LEGO Indiana Jones, LEGO Jurassic World, LEGO Marvel, LEGO Lord of the Rings. These games adapt movies constantly. But the important difference is that LEGO itself becomes the creative framework. You're not trying to perfectly recreate the film. You're recreating it through LEGO. That gives developers freedom. Characters don't need photorealistic faces. Animations can be exaggerated. Violence becomes slapstick. Environments can be simplified. Continuity doesn't need to be perfect, because the games have their own established gameplay formula. Developers aren't reinventing everything for each movie. LEGO accidentally solved one of the biggest problems with movie games. It created a standardized language for adaptation. Instead of asking, how do we turn this movie into a game, the question became, how do we turn this movie into a LEGO game? That's much easier. And because of that, LEGO became one of the last places where you could still experience something resembling the old movie tie-in game. But here's the funny thing. Licensed games are arguably healthier now than they've ever been. They just don't look like movie games anymore. Hogwarts Legacy, Marvel's Spider-Man, Star Wars Jedi, Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, Avatar Frontiers of Pandora. These aren't games designed to recreate a movie that's releasing next Friday. They're games designed to expand a universe. And Avatar Frontiers of Pandora is probably one of the clearest examples of how much the philosophy has changed. Massive Entertainment worked with Lightstorm Entertainment and Disney. But instead of simply recreating one of James Cameron's films, the developers created another part of Pandora, a new region, new characters, a separate story existing within the larger universe. That's a much more interesting relationship between games and movies. The game doesn't have to be the movie's little brother. It can exist beside it, and that's increasingly how Hollywood views games. Not merchandise, but world building. The same thing is happening in Star Wars. For years, Star Wars games bounced between direct adaptations and expanded universe materials. Now, something like Jedi Fallen Order can introduce Cal Kestis and tell a story specifically designed for a game. The question isn't, how do we recreate this movie? It's, what story can a video game tell inside this universe? That is a massive improvement. But I do think we lost something along the way. Modern licensed games are probably better on average. I don't think that's controversial. I'd rather have one Hogwarts Legacy than 6 Rush Harry Potter games releasing every time Daniel Radcliffe gets a haircut. But those old movie games had something modern gaming increasingly lacks: specificity. We got games about everything. Not because every movie deserved a video game, but because somebody thought there was money to be made. And that created weird games that would never exist today. A Barnyard open world, a Wall-E platformer, a Ratatouille game, a Cars racing game, a Bees movie game, a Shrek party game. These weren't billion-dollar IP properties being carefully managed across 15-year multimedia strategies. Sometimes they were just games. A studio got a license, they had 12 months, someone had an idea, and they made something. Was it always good? Absolutely not. But it created variety, and for kids especially, those games mattered. Not every game needed to be a 100-hour open-world epic. You could rent Over the Hedge on Friday, play it all weekend, and return it Monday, and probably never think about it again. Except 20 years later when some guy on YouTube puts it in a video and suddenly unlocks a memory you didn't know you had. That's valuable. Gaming has become very good at creating products designed to occupy enormous amounts of our time. Movie tie-ins came from an era where games were much more disposable, and weirdly, I kind of miss that idea. I also think movie games benefited from an ecosystem that doesn't necessarily exist anymore. Rental stores, used games, whatever your local equivalent was, movie games were perfect rental games. You didn't need to research them, you didn't need to watch a 40-minute review. You saw a character you recognized, grabbed the box, you took it home, and if it sucked, whatever. You returned it in 3 days. That dramatically lowered the risk of experimentation. Today, buying a $90 game digitally is a commitment. You're probably checking Metacritic, watching reviews, looking at gameplay, waiting for a sale. Back then, this has Spider-Man on it, sold, or rented, I guess. Physical retail also gave these games visibility. A kid walking through Walmart could see 20 games based on movies they recognized. The game itself was an ad. Digital storefronts don't work the same way. A random licensed game now competing with thousands upon thousands of games for attention. Recognition still matters, but the entire retail ecosystem that supported cheap licensed games has disappeared. And once again, mobile just does the job faster. There's another interesting reason modern licensed games moved away from direct adaptations. Franchises became obsessed with canon. Everything has to matter now, whether it be a movie, a TV show, a comic, a game, a spin-off, a post-credit scene. Some guy coughing in episode 4 of a Disney Plus series is secretly setting up a movie releasing in 2034.
He moves! Right there! Wait! Right there!
And that creates opportunities and problems for games. On the one hand, being canon makes a game feel important. Avatar: Frontiers of Pandora can exist as an actual part of that universe rather than as a disposable recreation of a film. But on the other hand, games take a very long time to make, so integrating them into a constantly evolving cinematic universe becomes incredibly complicated. The developers need freedom. They can't have every creative decision dependent on what another writer might decide to do in a movie 5 years from now. That's another reason self-contained stories work so well. Give the developer a corner of the universe, let them create characters, let them build mechanics around those characters. Let the game be a game, which sounds incredibly obvious, but for decades, licensed games weren't really allowed to do that. They were adaptations first, games second. The best modern licensed games reverse that. So I wanted to come back to the question, were movie games actually bad? Yes and no. There were plenty of terrible ones. There were cynical cash grabs. There were broken games. There were games clearly built by exhausted developers desperately trying to meet an impossible deadline. But I also think history has been unfair on the category. Because when we talk about licensed games, we tend to remember the disasters. E.T., Superman 64, all the random shovelware. But licensed games also gave us GoldenEye, Spider-Man 2, Lord of the Rings: Return of the King, Peter Jackson's King Kong, X-Men Origins Wolverine. And yes, Wolverine is another hilarious example, because somehow the video game adaptation of a mediocre movie was significantly better than the movie itself.
Thank God I'm blind.
That's the kind of thing I love about movie games. Sometimes the developer understood the appeal of the character better than the movie did, and occasionally being forced to build around a movie created something unique. Constraints aren't always bad. Sometimes having 18 months and a fixed set of characters forces developers to make quick, creative decisions. You don't get endless pre-production, you don't spend 7 years trying to create the ultimate everything game. You make something, you ship it, you move on. There's something refreshing about that. So, could movie tie-in games make a comeback? They could. Just not in the form we remember. The economics of a full AAA movie adaptation don't really make sense anymore. But the industry is starting to rediscover smaller games. And I think there is an opportunity there. Imagine a movie studio working with a smaller developer to create a 5-hour game, not an open world sandbox with infinite amounts of quests and hundreds of hours worth of content, not something that costs $200 million, just a tightly designed companion piece. Maybe it releases for $30 or $40. It doesn't recreate the movie, it just tells another story. You could even reuse environments or assets strategically. That feels like the modern version of the movie tie-in game, because the core idea was never actually bad. Movies and games are naturally compatible. You watch a world, then you want to explore it. You see a character do something cool, and then you want to do it. The problem was never games based on movies don't work. The problem was games based on movies need to release on the exact same day. Remove that restriction and suddenly the idea becomes much more interesting. Mad Max in 2015 is a good example of this. It wasn't actually a direct Fury Road adaptation. It had its own story and continuity, but it arrived in the same general era and benefited from the renewed interest in Mad Max. You got the fantasy of driving through the wasteland without Avalanche having to recreate the movie scene for scene. That's probably closer to the future. And Avatar: Frontiers of Pandora takes that philosophy even further. The film creates interest in the universe, the game expands on that universe. They support each other without being chained to one another. That's healthier. So what would movie games look like today? Imagine if the old system still existed. Every major movie gets a game. What would we have gotten? John Wick probably gets a third-person shooter developed in 18 months, and honestly, I'd play that. Mission Impossible gets a stealth game or an action game. Top Gun Maverick gets an arcade flight game. Godzilla Minus One gets some weird survival game where you spend most of the time running away from Godzilla. Dune gets a third-person action game where every level somehow ends with you fighting 20 Harkonnens. Barbie gets a surprisingly competent open-world game that becomes a cult classic 15 years later. Oppenheimer, maybe they don't make that one. Although I would absolutely play Oppenheimer the game if it inexplicably had a morality system. Especially, imagine they do alternate endings and your morality shifts whether you decide to drop the bomb or not. But that's the thing. We would get weird stuff. Some of it would be awful, but some of it might surprise us and be good. One of them would somehow introduce a mechanic that every game copies for the next decade. And 20 years later, we would all be arguing that the Paddington 2 game was secretly a masterpiece. I miss that unpredictability. So, where did the movie tie-in games go? They didn't die because gamers hated them. They died because the conditions that created them disappeared. Games became more expensive, development cycles became longer, quality expectations became higher, physical retail became less important, rental stores disappeared, mobile gaming took over the cheap licensed gaming market, and publishers realized that valuable IP could support standalone gaming franchises rather than disposable adaptations. The economics changed, the tech changed, the audience changed, and movie games evolved with them. Spider-Man 2 eventually became Marvel's Spider-Man. The Harry Potter tie-ins eventually became Hogwarts Legacy. Star Wars games gave way to stories like Jedi Fallen Order. The idea didn't disappear, it just matured, and objectively so. That's probably a good thing. We're getting better games, developers have more time, they're less constrained by movie scripts, they're allowed to create worlds instead of recreating scenes. But I still can't help but feel nostalgic for the old system, because there was something magical about watching a movie in theaters, loving it, going to a store a few days later, seeing the same character on the cover of a game and realizing, wait, I can play this? It didn't matter if the graphics were bad. It didn't matter if half the game had absolutely nothing to do with the movie. It didn't matter if the developers had clearly turned a 30-second chase sequence into 4 separate missions. You were back in that world. And when you're a kid, that's enough. So, movie tie-in games were products of a very specific moment in gaming history. A time when games were cheap enough to make quickly, movies were powerful enough to sell them, and expectations were low enough that a game didn't need to consume the next 5 years of your life to justify existing. Most of them were forgotten. Some of them deserved to be forgotten. But the best ones became something much more interesting than marketing. They became people's introduction to gaming. They became childhood favorites, and occasionally, they became classics. Games that started because somebody in a boardroom wanted to make another product on store shelves, and somehow became something worth remembering 20 years later. So no, I don't necessarily want the old movie tie-ins back. I don't need every Disney movie to come with a rushed $70 game. But I do miss an industry that was willing to make a game about basically anything. I miss shorter games, weird licensed games. I miss looking at a movie poster and wondering what the video game would be like. And maybe that's the real loss. And maybe the real loss isn't movie tie-in games themselves. Maybe it's the type of industry that allowed them to exist. An industry where not every release needed to become a billion-dollar franchise. Where a developer could make something in 18 months, ship it, and move on. Where sometimes a game could just be a game, even if it was based on the B movie.